Hello and welcome. I'm Debra Eisenman, Executive Vice President and COO at the Asia Society and Founding Director and Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about Myanmar with two renowned human rights experts who comprise 2/3 of the Special Advisory Council on Myanmar. Yanghee Lee, former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights on Myanmar, and Chris Sidoti, who was a member of the UN International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar. The Special Advisory Council for Myanmar is an independent group of international experts working to support the peoples of Myanmar in their fight for human rights, peace, democracy, justice, and accountability. And the Council has just released a compelling report on the state of play in Myanmar, a country of over 50 million that was under military rule for decades, has been embroiled in a 70-year civil war, but for nearly a decade starting in 2011 was undergoing a top-down democratic transition, which came to an abrupt and brutal halt in February 2021 with a military coup. With this in mind, Yanghee, Chris, what's the state of the country 3.5 years into the coup?
Well, I'd like to say, thank you for having us, and we're delighted to be part of this podcast. I'd like to remind our audience that you hear very little now, and you hear that the situation is very bad, which is very true, but you don't hear about a country where there's no country in the world where the people have stood against the attempted coup. The coup hasn't succeeded yet, and it's been 3.5 years, well into the fourth year, into year 4, where the people have stood up fearlessly against the military. And for the first time, all of the ethnic nationalities and the majority Bama are in line with fighting against the military junta.
But in spite of all those gains, the situation of the people can only be described as miserable. There have never been so many displaced people in Myanmar. The extent of the humanitarian crisis has never been greater. And the brutality of the military, long regarded as one of the most brutal in the world, has only intensified over the course of the last 3.5 years. Intensified, interestingly, because precisely of the positive developments that Yanghee has referred to. The more that the people are determined to resist the military's control, the more the military brutalises the situation as their only means of defence. The military is losing, and the people are being made to suffer.
What counterforces have arisen or fortified in these last 4 years?
The counterforces are very diverse. As Yanghee has indicated, the alliances that are now being forged between the ethnic nationalities and their long-standing, well-experienced, well-equipped militias, and with the Bama majority population, are without precedent. The military learned from the British colonial period that the best way to sustain control is through divide and rule, and they did that extremely successfully for decade after decade. But their bluff has now been called, and we are seeing collaboration between the various ethnic groups, including the Bama ethnic majority, at an unprecedented level. So that's the real hope of Myanmar, that we can see emerging a new Myanmar that is not only democratic, but united with a common commitment to nationhood. Now, there's still a long way to go. The struggle has only begun in that area. But there is a commitment there and a determination that we've not seen before.
In the first days after the coup attempt, you saw the young people risking their lives. And the young people, I think, it is where the future of Myanmar lies. And the young people are determined they've had the experience of a democracy and freedom of speech for a very short period of time, and they want to keep it that way. And the military, on the other hand, will want to quash any freedom of speech or any democratic movement in Myanmar. And the more the people resist, the more, as Chris said, the more brutal the army is. I won't call it the army, I'll call it the Tatmadaw, because they're not a national armed forces of Myanmar. They're just one ethnic armed Bama ethnic military. But the junta is bombarding and really destroying many of the cities. But what's really atrocious is they're targeting schools and they're targeting hospitals. Clearly, violence in contravention to all international norms, and war crimes is being committed, and crimes against humanity are being committed on a daily basis in Myanmar for the past 3.5 years.
Wow. Even before the coup, the military had never extracted itself from significant political power and key systems of government. Can you speak more about how the junta is running the country now? What portions of the country? And on the other side of the coin, there's this national unity government, which stood up post-coup, a number of them being elected officials, serving as a shadow government, some inside, some outside of the country. How are they and ethnic armed organizations providing leadership and services as the junta tries to crush things?
Well, thank you for that question, and I'd like to correct you, Debra,
Please.
that it's not a shadow government, because it is the legitimate government. But many people around the world think the military is the de facto government, but military is not de facto government at all. They are losing ground, and as our research and our analysis shows that we've looked at 330 plus townships, and we were able to map 14% of the 340 townships that are uncontested, that are under the junta rule. That's about it, and they've lost all of the borders, and the military, the junta, is not able to deliver services. The only service that they can deliver is visas. And that's why the UN wants to have the presence there, and many of the foreign diplomats are still there through the junta's ability to stamp the visas. Other than that, we see in the ethnic areas where services are being delivered in ethnic communities, there are ethnic states that have full functioning judiciary, full functioning administration, health services, education is going on in these other ethnic areas.
Yes. At the international level, there are only two claimants to represent Myanmar, being the military and the National Unity Government. And there is no doubt when we compare the two, the National Unity Government has the de jure claim, that is, it is a legitimate government that is the product of the elected members of the Parliament from 2020. And it also has a much stronger de facto claim than the military does because of control of territory, control of effective governmental functions. Now, that's not to say that the National Unity Government itself is the sole actor in all of these areas. The ethnic organisations that Yanghee has referred to play enormously important roles. Most of them either recognise the national leadership of the NUG or prepared to cooperate with the NUG while wanting to focus very much on their own territorial national areas, which is fair enough. But there are some ethnic organisations that don't recognise the leadership of the NUG, and that's to be expected at this stage. So it's a patchwork picture, but certainly if we're looking at is the military or is the NUG more appropriately recognised as the representative of the state of Myanmar, there's no question about that. It's the NUG. If we're looking at where governmental functions are being delivered, as Yanghee describes, it's in those areas where the ethnic organisations or the NUG or a collaboration of both are developing and delivering essential governmental services. The military, putting it bluntly, bottom line, ain't capable of much.
And I want to come back to a lot of the points you made on the NUG, because I know in the recommendations and the excellent report you've written, you talk a lot about the recognition of the NUG and really bringing them to the fore internationally. But before we do that, can you speak a little bit more about what has happened to the economy? I mean, the country was growing before this coup. What has happened to education, to healthcare? COVID hit right during the coup. Doctors weren't being able to administer care. Hospitals were understaffed. Can you talk a bit what's happened there and how people are coping and where areas this is working and where perhaps it's not?
Should I go first?
Yes.
Look, the economy in the nation as a whole is a basket case. It's almost true to say that there is no economy, and certainly no economy in the sense of a modern nation state with a modern economy. In the military-controlled areas, almost nothing has happened, and there is an economic crisis. The military is starved for funds, as it should be. We have long advocated the cutting of all economic ties that lead to cash going into the hands of the military. And economic sanctions, where they have been imposed by a number of states, are proving already to be very effective. Perhaps the best indicator of that is that the military has very little access to foreign reserves and is even talking about promoting a bartering system because they just don't have foreign currency. And their approach to domestic currency is to print more and more and more money, so inflation is enormous and people in military control areas struggle to sustain the very minimum standard of living for life to be livable. In the ethnic controlled and more generally resistance controlled areas, there is an economy continuing, but struggles because it was operating from such a poor base. The most important thing for us to say, though, is that the shift of effective control on the ground over the last 6 months has meant that there are new and different opportunities for economic development of Myanmar. Myanmar, when the military took over back in 1960, was one of the richest countries in Asia. It is now, after all that years, 60 years of military domination, one of the poorest countries in the world. So there is a desperate need for economic development. The fact that the resistance organisations now control such large territories makes it possible for the rest of the planet, organisations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, international governmental donors, private companies, to talk about economic development strategies for the liberated areas. And that very much needs to be the focus. It is an absolutely urgent priority, but it is now possible to economically development large sections of Myanmar without the money finding its way into the pockets of the generals.
Well, Debra, you mentioned about the COVID, where the military stopped all medications and they were targeting ambulances and clinics. And the oxygen tanks, they were hoarding for their own use. But we have to remember that it was the doctors that were the first CDMers, we call them civil disobedience movements, and they were still providing assistance to the general population. When we talk about effective control in our research, people think it's the territorial control, but we looked at it from 3 different dimensions. One would be, of course, the territorial dimension is one. The second is the ability to govern. And we're seeing more and more that the junta-dominated areas, the ability to govern is dwindling. And the third area is the people's acceptance. Normally, when there's a coup, people will, whether they like it or not, be it authoritarian government or not, the people will accept that that is life. But in the case of Myanmar, the acceptance is not there by the people.
Thank you for that. Before we talk about the recommendations in your report and what you think lies ahead and what others can do, I want to talk about one ethnic group that hasn't come up yet today. Given your former incredible roles in Myanmar on human rights fact-finding mission as UN Special Rapporteur, can can we speak a bit about the plight of the Rohingya and what's happened since the ethnic cleansing campaign since 2017 and the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of people? Can you talk about where that stands today and how the Rohingya are doing?
There's more than 1 million Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar camps, and the number is growing. Mm-hmm. And we've had about 250 prior to the 2016 and 17 purge. They go back to in the 90s. There's been several waves, and many of them were born in the refugee camps. We are worried about the northern Rakhine, where majority of the Rohingyas live there, Utidong and Mongdo, and in Sittwe, still after the 2012, what they call it, intercommunal violence, they were placed in IDP camps, and in Chokpyu, even the recognized of the 135 ethnic nationalities, races, the Kaman Muslims were even put in IDP camps for several years. Now, this is the population where there is a lost generation. They have not had any education from 2012 after the violence, the communal violence. And so it's been now 12 years since then. And the people living in Cox's Bazar, there is no formal education for them. And so I think the international community should be really worried about the large number of children who have no education or no livelihood skills, and that I call them the lost generation.
The situation today is not the same as it was in 2016 or 2017 during the period of mass expulsions, but it's very troubling. There's been a recurrence of anti-Rohingya violence in northern Rakhine State over the last few weeks. There appear to be a variety of different reasons, different interpretations of that, but there doesn't seem to be any doubt that there has been incidents of significant violence which have resulted in a significant number of deaths and a very large number of expulsions, not internationally but internally. So the problem has not gone away. It's not only not gone away for the million in Bangladesh, but for these around 600,000 still in Rakhine State, and for the reasons that Yanghee has described. We need to revive international interest in and commitment to the human rights of Rohingya people, both those who are in Bangladesh and those who remain in Rakhine State. The position of the Arakan Army, which is now the dominant group in most of Rakhine State, is complex and still to be proven. We know that there have been incidents in the past of Rakhine violence against Rohingya. We know that there have been Rakhine political parties and Rakhine military groups that have been involved in anti-Rohingya violence. The Arakan Army is making public assurances of respect for all the people of Rakhine State, including the Rohingya, but that needs to be proven. So the heat at the moment is very much on the Arakan Army to prove that they act for all the people of Rakhine State and not just for the Rakhine people. We can understand, after a very long period of repression of the Rakhine people by the military, why there is a priority for the majority population of concern. But we cannot understand, we cannot accept, and we fear what happens for minorities, particularly the Rohingya minority, as the politics and the military situation in Rakhine changes. It's up to the Arakan Army now to prove its credentials, to prove its commitment to human rights.
Thank you, Chris. As we look back at the country holistically, as you've said in this conversation today, the military hasn't consolidated its power over the country. They don't have control over most of the border territories. There are analysts who are pretending the complete downfall of the junta, others that are talking about fragmentation of the country. What do you think lies ahead?
There's going to be more violence, more clashes by the junta. the more the people resist, the junta is going to use more air power, and that's why it's so important for international community here in the UN to have jet fuel sanctions, aviation fuel sanctions. But right now, we want to see that the junta, and I think they will eventually, but we don't know when, recede most of their control, because as Chris said, the country was very rich in the past. The country is very poor now, but at the same time, the generals and the cronies have become very rich, and now they're frustrated because some of their income is not coming as they wanted to come in.
And there are, in those circumstances, a wide range of possibilities for Myanmar. The military may win, although we think that's unlikely. The country could fragment, although we think that's unlikely. We don't expect fragmentation. In fact, we are seeing a greater deal of commonality across the ethnic national groups, including, importantly, between the minority groups and the Burma majority for the first time. So we identify a future direction that is the opposite of fragmentation, that is increasing commitment to a nation, that is Myanmar. The military could continue the war for a long time. It could change very quickly as well. We've seen that happen historically in many parts of the world. But its strategy seems to be retreating and fortifying the major cities and looking to the future where they control a significant part of the population. They have the vestiges, the clothes of power, but no more effective clothing than the Emperor in Hans Andersen's story. There's nothing there if you look underneath it. So they are fortifying the cities like Yangon and Mandalay and Naypyidaw and a couple of others of the major cities. And I think they're while not for a minute conceding that they're losing, I think their actions, in fact, show a mindset that is conceding most of the country and a decision to fortify the population centres and try to defend them. And the resistance, wisely in my opinion, is not attempting or contemplating head-on attacks on the major cities, but rather besieging them. And it's not generally reported, but the capital city, the military's capital, Naypyidaw, is almost surrounded. There is almost no possibility of road transport into Naypyidaw at this stage. And the major road left open is the Mandalay to Naypyidaw road. That is subject to attack. They're moving in, and Naypyidaw could soon be a besieged city. And the direction that we expect will be more of that. There's no sign of the military giving up, and it probably won't give up under its current leadership, because if it does, it's the end of that leadership. You know, Min Aung Hlaing is hanging on because there ain't no option for him. Whether he's able to hang on in the face of increasing military dissatisfaction with his persistent failures is another matter. But not under this current leadership is there any prospect of a negotiated settlement. So long as the current military leadership is there, we will see a withdrawal into fortified cities in the hope that they can hang on by their fingernails to the edge of the barricades.
And how do Myanmar's large neighbours, particularly China and India, view this kind of instability at their borders, and what are they doing about Myanmar?
Well, China doesn't like instability. I get worried that I think much of the media reporting of China's approach to Myanmar, in my view, does not reflect the reality. First and foremost, China wants stability in Myanmar, and it wants to protect its economic interests in Myanmar, and it wants to advance its geopolitical, strategic interests through Myanmar. And China will always act, as most nation states do, in the interests of China, as they perceive it. So we've seen China over the 3.5 years tilting slightly one way or the other at different times as it makes reassessments of the tides of battle, while at all stages having a foot in each camp to protect its interests. I think, looking at some recent developments, that there's a growing awareness on the part of the Chinese leadership that the military cannot win. And so we are seeing China shift more. There are signs that it's dealing directly now in a more serious way with the opposition forces. And particularly as we see more and more territory being controlled by the opposition forces, including territory that is important to China, like the port of Chokpyu in Rakhine State and the railway that runs between Yunnan and Chokpyu, both of which are now largely under resistance control. China's economic interests are going to lie in dealing with the resistance. India is surprisingly somewhat more complex than China. And India's had a long military-to-military relationship with the Myanmar military, and I think that's the basic problem. I don't know that there is all that much civilian government interest in Myanmar on the part of the Indian government, except in relation to countering China. But it's going to be very hard to break the Indian military's mindset that it has an ally in the Myanmar military. But even India is going to have to face up to that fact as the Myanmar military keeps on losing. If they can't win, India will not be interested in them.
And the recent cyber scam, I think that should really worry China. And there's been more clashes on the borders of China and Myanmar, in the northern Myanmar, that really worries China. But the indication that the long postponed Chinese development projects, like the Midzone Dam, the Dawei projects, they're being resuscitated now. I think that's an indication that perhaps that's a sign where China is negotiating or engaging more directly with the ethnic resistance, as Chris is saying, because they're not satisfied with the military. Yeah, because otherwise the roads are all being controlled by the resistance groups, and without their the projects can't go, and I think they feel that the military is losing. That's why they're resuscitating these programs. Yeah.
And that last point's an important one. The trade routes between Myanmar and China, both road and rail, are now predominantly in the hands of the resistance.
That's incredibly interesting. I'd love to turn to now in our final minutes, really what you think others can do to help Myanmar. So looking at the U.S., the UN, ASEAN in particular, what do you recommend happens next to support the people of Myanmar?
From the time we were set up, which is now just after the military staged its coup, 3 and a bit years ago, we've had two fundamental objectives. The first is to provide as much support as we can to the resistance movement, the democratic movement at the beginning, which has become the resistance movement. And the second is to do as much as we can to undermine the military. Those two objectives still remain our objectives, and they're the objectives that we advocate with the representatives of other nations that we meet. In relation to the first of supporting the democratic movement, that means knowing what's going on the ground, supporting the development of the national unity government, recognising the plurality of Myanmar with the ethnic organisations. In a humanitarian sense, ensuring that humanitarian aid gets through, which means going through on the ground in conjunction with the NUG and the ethnic organisations, not only dealing with the military, as most United Nations agencies and most governments are continuing to do. And then, as I mentioned earlier, looking at economic development in the resistance-controlled areas. So building up the democratic movement in these ways. So far as undermining the military is concerned, we've had 3 strategies, the 3 cuts. Cut weapons, cut cash, cut impunity. And we continue to see those 3 strategies as important. Some of them are bearing fruit already. The arms supply is greatly reduced compared to what it was. Ironically, one of the more positive results of the Ukraine war is that Russia is no longer capable of being the major arms supplier to the Myanmar military. So they are having increasing difficulty. They are doing a lot of domestic production of ammunition and light weapons now, and we have investigated that. We'll shortly be publishing another report on that, looking at cutting supply chains and technology transfers that enables them to produce weapons locally. Cutting the cash, the sanctions policy has been working and is hurting. There is absolutely no doubt about that. It's unfortunate that the Security Council is so dysfunctional that it will not impose arms and economic sanctions on the military and the military leadership. But in the absence of an effective Security Council, individual states have stepped up and more need to do so. And on impunity, we are seeing the investigation in the International Criminal Court continue. It should come to a head. We need arrest warrants, and we need people who are marked out for trial so that they can be judged as to whether they have committed the war crimes and crimes against humanity that, in our view, they have committed. We can't get the Security Council to do a comprehensive referral to the International Criminal Court, but we have looked at alternative systems of international justice. We produced a significant paper on that last year, which canvasses a range of ways in which international accountability can be ensured. So in each of these 3 areas, there are steps that can be taken, practical steps, immediate steps, and we continue to advocate for those.
The role of the ASEAN countries will be more crucial as the days go by. I think Thailand has the longest sharing border with Myanmar, and Thailand can play a tremendous role in providing across-the-border humanitarian assistance. And once it crosses the border to the ethnic states, they've been working on providing their own humanitarian assistance for the past 70 years when they were fighting against the military. And they have the networks and they have the knowledge, and they can, they've assured us that they can help in getting the cross-the-border assistance to the heartland of Myanmar, to where there's a greater number of population.
And as we talk about ASEAN, years ago they released a 5-point consensus plan on Myanmar to try to help close the conflict, figure out the conflict. It was a fairly toothless plan. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how they could build on that, or what you might see ahead for ASEAN and Myanmar.
I'll start off, and Chris will add to it. I'm sure the ASEAN countries will not like this, but we've been very vocal that the 5-point consensus, we understand it was adopted by consensus, and Min Aung Hlaing was there to adopt this as consensus, but it really was dead on arrival. But still, when the UN and others speak about cling on to the 5-point consensus, we think that the situation has completely changed since 3 years ago when they came up with the 5-point consensus. First of all, Min Aung Hlaing is not the person to deal with anymore, and the second is their reliance on the AHA Center, the ASEAN Humanitarian Agency, was not the right choice, but because the AHA Center does not have the mandate, nor the resources, nor the capacity to deliver humanitarian assistance to the parts of Myanmar that are in dire need of humanitarian assistance.
And if the 5-point consensus is to continue to be the basis on which ASEAN looks at the situation in Myanmar and its relationship with Myanmar, it's going to have to confront the question of what does that mean now? As Yanghee says, the situation now, 3 and a bit years down the track, is totally different from when it was on, I think it was the 24th of April 2021, the 5-point consensus was adopted. It desperately needs replacement. But if, because of ASEAN's consensual approach, it's not replaced, and if that continues to be the basis on which they work, then ASEAN has to say, what does it now mean? What are the actions that need to be taken to advance the vision that they had 3.5 years ago? Unless ASEAN takes account of the situation in Myanmar now, it will simply make itself irrelevant to the future development of one of its members.
Thank you, Yanghee and Chris. That's all the time we have left, but I so appreciate this illuminating conversation and your sharing your time and expertise with us on what lies ahead for Myanmar and what the international community can do to support the Myanmar people. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.